So in this video, we're going to talk about the interview structure for some of the product manager roles at some of these FAANG companies so that you can learn how to best prepare for interviews. Hey guys, I'm Diana and I'm a senior product manager at a large tech company based in Silicon Valley, California. If you're looking to apply for product manager roles, you're probably considering the FAANG companies. That stands for Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google. Why? Well, these are some of the most competitive companies to get to. And no surprise, because they're also some of the most well-paid, and some of these companies are known to be fun work cultures with a lot of perks.
Oh, that's right. It's a nap pod.
So we're going to go through number 1, the interview structure for 3 companies specifically: Amazon, Facebook, and Google. 2, I'm going to share some example questions. 3, we're going to talk about how to best prepare to answer these questions. And 4, we're going to compare amongst these 3, which are the easiest interviews that you can prepare for and the hardest to prepare for. So what's the structure for the Amazon interview? So it's 2 to 3 rounds: a recruiter conversation, a phone screen, and then on-site. So the recruiter conversation, which might be optional, is to assess why you're interested in the role and whether you understand what the role entails. The phone screen is an hour conversation with an existing product manager or your hiring manager to assess, again, whether you understand what this role entails and the space that you're applying for. But they're also going to be testing you on a minimum of 2 of the leadership principles of Amazon. So you might be asking, what the heck are leadership principles? Well, Amazon is famous for their 14 leadership principles shown here. So some of those are around customer obsession, bias towards action, simplicity, frugality, and the list goes on. But they're basically gonna be asking you about examples where you've displayed those leadership principles. Your on-site round, the 3rd round, encompasses of 5 interviews, 1 hour each, and each of them with different functions across the product team. So a technical program manager, a software developer, maybe a product designer might interview you again to assess the leadership principles and look for examples where you've exhibited it or did not. And in these interviews, it's not just you telling the story, but prepare to be bombarded with follow-up questions that might assess how you make trade-offs between different leadership principles. So basically, the Amazon interview is mostly behavioral interviews, not very much focused on case questions like some of the other ones we'll talk about later in the video. So some example questions. So if they're testing the customer obsession leadership principle, they might say, tell me about a time where you stood up for the voice of the user. If they're testing frugality, they might ask a question like, tell me about a time where you turned down resources to complete a project. So how might you best prepare for these interviews? Well, first, go understand Amazon's 14 leadership principles. Second, brainstorm a couple of stories, 2 examples at least for each leadership principle. Third, put your stories in the STAR framework so it's organized and digestible. Fourth, go practice with someone and have a mock interview to share your responses and ask your mock interviewer whether your example is a good example in displaying the leadership principle, and ask them to ask you a bunch of follow-up questions. And you also want to make sure that you understand the role that you're applying to and the space. For example, if you're applying for a role in Amazon's web services, so AWS, you probably want to understand how infrastructure and cloud computing works. So some other stuff. Despite hearing from most people that the Amazon interview is mostly behavioral, I've heard from certain candidates that they did receive product design type of questions, and some even received a take-home assignment to assess their writing style. And if you're applying for a technical product manager role, then you most likely want to prepare for the technical component of it. Is this helpful so far? If so, make sure to like the video so more people can find it, and comment below to let me know which other companies are you interested in applying to that I could be creating these type of videos for you to help you understand what to expect in the interview. All right, let's talk about the Facebook or Meta interview. So the structure, it'll encompass of 3 rounds. First round with the recruiter, second is a phone screen, and third is the on-site. So the first round with the recruiter is basically to get to know your previous experience and whether you've displayed some of the core product management skills, and asking you questions like, why do you want to work for Facebook as a product manager? The second round is a phone screen. 2 interviews, 45 minutes each, testing product design skills and execution skills, which is basically using data to help you make decisions, to help you define success, and to help you decide what's going on when metrics go down. So the product sense / product design part is to test your ability to come up with products for very open-ended topics. So an example would be, what product would you build for the travel space? And then you have execution questions like, what success metrics would you set for Facebook events? How would you decide between launching X versus Y? What would you do if Facebook events went down by 10%? And lastly, the on-site round is at least 3 interviews. So 2 of those interviews, again 45 minutes each, are going to be product sense / product design. Second, another execution question. And thirdly, the leadership and drive interview, which is a behavioral interview asking you questions like, tell me about a time when you had a conflict on your team. And these are to assess how you as a product manager functions on a team. So how do you best prepare for the Facebook interview? Well, first, you want to develop a framework for these type of questions. And here, you might develop your own unique framework. You might look at some videos, check out my previous videos, where we talk about frameworks that can help you think through the answer, and then do a bunch of practice questions to help you go deep and use your empathy for the product sense question. And for the execution question, you'll want to prepare by playing around with the top 10 or 20 of Facebook products. You can practice the trade-off question by asking yourself, what data might I use in order to just make this decision? And for the leadership and drive question, your best way to prepare is to look for existing questions that were asked and then think of examples and stories that you can tell using the STAR framework in order to communicate some of the key principles that they're looking for. So Facebook doesn't necessarily have 14 leadership principles, but your recruiter will tell you these are the traits that we're looking for in testing the leadership and drive interview. Now let's talk about Google. So what is the structure for the Google interview? Also 3 rounds. First conversation with the recruiter. They'll be asking you, well, why do you want to work at Google as a product manager? And they're going to be testing you in parallel on your communication skills, your motivation, and that generally you'll be someone good to work with on a team. So your second round is going to be anywhere from 45 to 50 minutes with an existing Google product manager. And here they're going to be asking you questions along 3 categories. So product design, analytical, or estimation. And their questions could be a mix of the 3. So product design is really similar to what we talked about under Facebook's interview, where they're going to ask you to build a product in a very open-ended space with certain constraints. So a question might be, design a phone for the blind. Or they might be asking you to improve an existing product, like, how would you improve Google Maps? The analytical portion is meant to test that you can use data to help you make decisions. So it's also kind of similar to Facebook's execution type interview. For example, a question would be, what are YouTube's key metrics? And then the estimation question is meant to test that you can size a market. For example, a question that you could get is estimate the number of videos watched daily on YouTube. And the on-site interview is about 5 interviews, which encompasses of the 3 things we just talked about, product sense, analytical, and estimation, but adds 2 more other categories, which is behavioral. So that's to test your Googliness and alignment with their culture fit. So they might ask a question like, tell me about a time when you failed. And then there's the technical part, which could be high-level system design questions about how products work, or it could be questions around popular algorithms and data structures and trade-offs between them. For example, how does Google Docs work? Or design the algorithm for YouTube's recommendation engine. So how might you prepare for all different 5 categories? So for the product design question, you'll want to, again, similar to the Facebook interview, come up with a structure that's going to help you answer the most commonly asked questions and practice that on a bunch of products. But especially for Google, your solutions, you want to come up with moonshot ideas.
Moonshot is an idea so big, so bold.
So these are really creative or innovative ideas because that's what they're going to look for. For the analytical portion, you'll want to come up with metrics for 5 to 10 most commonly used Google products. Then you'll want to do that for the most commonly used other apps like Uber, Instacart. You'll want to learn about how to set up A/B tests. And for the trade-off question, you'll want to figure out what data should I use as my criteria to make decisions. And for the estimation question, you'll want to get certain numbers that are going to help you plug it into the equation that you develop to come up with your answer. For example, you'll want to know what the population of the US is or some of the larger countries in the world. You'll also want to know metrics for Google products. For example, what are the number of monthly active users for a YouTube or Google search? These are going to be numbers that are going to be handy in plugging into your equation. And then another part you want to practice for estimation is being able to break down what they ask you into an equation. So think about an equation, you'll have variables, and then you'll have the thing that comes after the equal sign. And after you get good at that, you'll then want to practice how to make your answer even more accurate. So maybe instead of using averages, you then segment based on the different cases. How do you prepare for the behavioral interview? Well, look up a couple of questions that Google usually asks in these interviews and think of stories, plug them into the STAR framework, and also understand what are the traits that Google looks for to exhibit googliness. And those are the things that you want to make sure to highlight in your action section of the STAR framework. Lastly, for the technical part of the interview, you'll want to familiarize yourself with popular algorithms or popular data structures, the trade-offs between them. You'll want to practice some system design questions and figure out, well, what are components I can use to make these systems more scalable, efficient, and reliable. Research some more basic technical things like how does the internet work? And maybe familiarize yourself with, for the common Google products, how do they work? And lastly, consider researching some tech trends. I'd love for you to comment below which of these interview portions seems the scariest. Now, let's compare the interviews. We're going to rank them from easiest to hardest, and we're going to talk about where there are similarities and differences. So first, all 3 interviews will have a behavioral section asking you questions like, tell me about a time. All 3 of them have about 3 rounds with the recruiter, phone screen, and on-site round. Now the differences, Amazon is mostly behavioral focused, so questions like tell me about a time align with their leadership principles, versus Google and Facebook are going to be more case questions. Between Google and Facebook, they both will be testing questions around product design and analytical questions like how you might use data to help you make a decision or define success metrics. But Google's interviews have a bit more scope where they'll be testing you estimation questions and technical questions which are not expected in the Facebook interview. So if I was to say the easiest interviews that you can prepare for, I would say those are the Amazon interviews where you can easily study the 14 leadership principles and prepare ahead of time the examples that you'll want to talk about and do a couple mock interviews with people asking you follow-up questions so you can watch out for the different types of questions that the interviewer might actually ask as follow-ups. Your key framework here is to use the STAR framework. And hence, there's basically one framework that you'll have to remember. Of course, there's so much room for ambiguity based on the follow-up questions they ask you, but you can ahead of time prepare for about 80-90% of the interview. So in second place from the easiest to the hardest spectrum, I would say lies the Facebook interviews. Here, they're mostly testing just 2 components. We talked about the product design and the product execution. And hence the frameworks that you'll have to use are around 3 frameworks at the least to answer their questions. And the questions are kind of well scoped in that you're most likely to expect a question where they ask you to set goals for one of the Facebook products. So what are the hardest interviews? Well, you might have guessed based on when I went through all 3 interviews, Google's interviews have a lot more scope. They cover 5 different sections. They also encompass of a technical portion. So for product managers who don't have a technical background, you're going to have to do a lot of studying up on these more technical concepts that might be basic for an engineer. And also it encompasses of the estimation questions, which could be tricky for some. First, there's a shock of getting some pretty insane questions. For example, a question that I've heard they've asked before is how many drivers are needed for a mid-sized city if Google was to create a ride-sharing application? And even the breadth of what each of the sections covers in terms of questions vary pretty widely. So you're going to have to use more than 3 separate frameworks in order to answer some of these questions. And sometimes your frameworks are going to break entirely. So you're going to have to come up with frameworks on the spot. And we talked about the technical questions, and I've seen a lot of variability between what technical questions are asked. So there was one question about how does the communication between Mars and Earth work? Who thinks about that in their day-to-day?
That's hard. That's super hard.
But there's also questions like, how would you design YouTube's recommendation engine? Or a question like, what happens when you navigate to a website? So I don't see an obvious framework that can tackle all 3 of those questions, and all of that come under the technical section. So if you're thinking about applying to all 3 of these companies and preparing for the interviews, so you'll probably want to set your interview dates based on easiest to hardest. Meaning, if you get an interview with Amazon, set that to be the earliest. And if you get an interview with Google, set that out to a later date. And I mentioned for both Facebook and Google, they'll be asking about product sense / product design type of questions. So take a look at this playlist where I talk about and go into details on how to set up a framework to answer those questions. And for the Facebook and Google interview, they're going to be asking questions to test how you use data to make decisions and come up with metrics. So take a look at this playlist on how you can best answer those questions. And I'll see you guys in the next video.